Welcome to a quick guide to accident investigation. My name's Andrew Moll. I'm the Chief Inspector of Marine Accidents. I've been working there for about 16 years. Prior to that, I was in the Royal Navy, grew up in Norfolk, sailing on the Norfolk Broads. But from RYA perspective, I'm a powerboat trainer and also a yachtmaster power. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about. So today's session is going to be a quick guide to accident investigation, a whistle-stop tour of investigating accidents. It takes the MEIB a year to 18 months to train an accident investigator, and I'm not going to be able to cover everything in the next 35 minutes to make you expert accident investigators. But what I will try to do is cover a little bit of the following. A discussion about why investigate at all, what should be investigated, some thoughts on that. A bit about interviewing, because that's probably one of the most important things to focus on, and then talk a little bit about other information and context, a little bit about analysis, and then reports and recommendations, as I say, around about 30 to 35 minutes worth. So why investigate accidents and incidents? Well, I suppose the first point to make is it's just good safety management practice. It represents a good safety culture in your organisation, that you're able to show that you are investigating the things that happen to you and your staff and your students or whoever you're in charge of. The second point, though, is that the feedback from accident investigation improves risk assessments and operating procedures. I'm hoping that if you're running any sort of commercial organisation, you are doing risk assessments for that. And I would also hope or suggest that your risk assessments are task-based. So you're not thinking perhaps, what's the risk? Oh, someone could fall in the water. It is thinking about launching a boat, boarding craft, whatever it is the processes that you're doing and the risks associated with the processes rather than risks in isolation, because thinking about it in those terms then enables you to write operating procedures, which then hopefully capture the risks and make it safe for everyone. And I suppose the third point to make is that failure to learn lessons is viewed pretty poorly if it happens again, be that by the courts, the RYA, by the MEIB. If you've had an accident or a pretty serious incident and you didn't learn the lessons from it, then that doesn't look very good. And I think we're all pretty familiar with this in RYA terms: plan, do, review. So you plan it, you do the do, you review the do, and if the do's not good enough, you plan the do again, so the whole thing goes around in a circle. And it's good practice again to review all your operating procedures on perhaps an annual basis, but a trigger for perhaps an out of turn review would be an accident. So that's why we do it. But before we get into how we do it, some thoughts about the component of an accident. So here, ripped off the internet from Shutterstock, apologies to them, is a picture of an accident, and we've got a yacht sinking. Doesn't matter what it is, but that's the actual accident itself. There will be some events that have led up to this accident that you might want to focus on, and indeed how the accident is handled is also pretty important. If it's handled well, it's something to chat about over a beer later in the evening. If it's handled badly, the same thing can end up as front page headlines. So it may not be the accident itself which is the focus. It's how it's handled which is the focus of your investigation. So let's unpack that a bit. Usually some pre-existing weakness in the system of work or equipment that creates a safety vulnerability, a trigger event that tips the scales to create an accident, and finally, how the event is handled can often determine the severity of the outcome. And before getting into the accident investigation, let's just give you some examples of that. So on the left-hand side, we've got this unsafe condition, this pre-existing weakness, whatever it is. It could be a design weakness, and here at MEIB, particularly with leisure craft, we focus really heavily on design weaknesses. We feel that people should buy boats and equipment that is fit for purpose, and where we find that it isn't, we get stuck in there. It could be something isn't manufactured to the standards that it ought to be. Could be perhaps that maintenance hasn't been done to the system, and when money is tight, maintenance is quite often one of the first things that goes to the wall. Could be that the operators don't have the system knowledge they need. Could be over the course of the season, the system's degraded a bit. Could be inadequate procedures, and so on and so on. A whole raft of things that could be something that create the preconditions for an accident. We then move on to the trigger event. Could be material failure. Someone or something is overstressed or overwhelmed, maloperation, and so on. And we could spend a lot of time talking about trigger events, but it's the thing that pushes it over the edge and into this accident, for instance, we're going to investigate. And then the next thing is how it's dealt with, and a poor reaction can be a result of a failure to detect the problem. And one of my favourites, of course, is the bilge alarm that doesn't work, and so some pipe or a stern gland or something has been leaking quite merrily away, and by the time you've gone down the companionway and realised that you're standing ankle deep in water, it's pretty difficult to locate the leak underwater and address it. If the bilge alarm had been working properly, much earlier identification of that would have been possible. Could be lack of procedures. Do you have a procedure for dealing with a flood? And maybe you do have a procedure that people haven't been trained in dealing with floods, so it could be lack of training. And back to my earlier point, a failure to learn lessons from things that have happened before. If someone's coming back in after a day's worth of training and saying, we're having to pump the bilges quite a lot during these trips, you might want to take that as a trigger to get in there and find out why something is leaking that shouldn't be. The components of an accident, the stuff that goes on before, as well as the trigger event and how it's handled afterwards, all perhaps in scope for an investigation and things to think about. So moving on to my next topic, and that is, what is your threshold for investigating? And I can't really be specific or categoric about this, because it will depend upon the operation that you're running. But what I would suggest is it's a bit like reefing. If you're thinking about it, then doing it. So if you're saying to yourself, well, should I be investigating that? Then the answer is probably yes, and you ought to be getting on with it. So suppose it's you're running a powerboat training centre, and there's a loss of control of a rib. If it ends up like this, then maybe that's something that you specifically want to take a deeper interest in. And then ask yourself, what about a man overboard? Well, if someone falls over the side, but the boat goes round, picks them up, there's a bit of damaged pride and someone's a bit wet, but that's it. Does that warrant an investigation? Well, again, think about it, because if this could have been the outcome, then perhaps the answer is yes. That is something that needs investigating. So before you get to the stage of investigating action, just thinking about your threshold. What is it that's going to pique your interest and get you into what is potentially a bit of a time-consuming activity? What are we trying to do? We're trying to find out what happened. We're trying to find out how it happened. Trying to find out why it happened. That's the important bit, and then identify ways of preventing it happening again. And a good way to start, of course, is to interview all those involved. But it is good sense to have a plan before you start. You're going to want to hear the witness's account. Of course you are. You're probably going to want to probe that account for detail. Probably a good idea to summarise back to the witness what you've heard. That is quite an emotional topic in academic circles, because in summarising and repeating back to the witness what you've heard, you're using your words potentially rather than theirs, and that can twist the account. However, from the practitioner's point of view, I would suggest that it is quite useful to summarise back to the witness what you have understood, and they can then correct you if you've got it wrong. And then the next bit is to fill in all the gaps, because the witness won't have told you everything that you want to know, and this is your agenda. So what is your agenda? Well, the accident investigators over the years have come up with lots of ways of doing this, but one of my favourites is simply SHELL. It's an acronym for a methodical approach to building an agenda for things you want to know. In the centre of our SHELL, we have the L for our liveware. And why have we got people in the middle? Well, the reality is that around about 80% of the statisticians tell us of accidents, marine accidents, involve some form of human element, human function in some way or other. Of course, there are material failures, but then humans are involved in fitting and maintenance and so on. So people are pretty central to accident investigation. And then round the outside, we've got the other L on the left of the other people they're interfacing with. You've got the software, all the procedures and so on, the hardware and the environment. And there, in slightly more detail, is all of that. The environment could be anything really that that is relevant to how this accident has taken place. The software, all the non-physical aspects of the system, the procedures, the software, the checklists, and so on. Hardware, again, all of it: technology, equipment, tools, and then the liveware, the other people, the social aspects of it, the teamwork, the work groups, the communication, the briefing, and all that sort of stuff. So it's a way of thinking about things. And again, this is, if you like, stock material. It's found in the textbooks, but what I've done is I've sort of created my own version of this. Sits on the side of my desk. It's useful to me sitting at the MEIB, because you never know when someone's going to phone you up and want to talk to you about an accident that they've had. You've got that phone call, the opportunity to talk to them, so you need to swing into action pretty quickly. So I have my own little sort of mental crib sheet. It's not particularly extensive, but it does help me just go around the key things that I want to talk about. So planning before you get into interviewing, always worth knowing. Worth doing. You want to know, of course, what has happened, but in the background, you'll have a bunch of questions that you're going to want to ask, and it's worth getting those on paper in some form or another. So we talked about doing the interviewing. Let's unpack that a little bit more. You could go straight into the interview and just start asking questions, but if you're asking fairly closed questions, what will happen is that your witness will just answer your questions, and actually what you want them to do is tell you as much as they possibly can about the events that transpired. And the best way to do that is ask nice, open questions. For those of you who've done the RYA coaching training, this will be completely familiar with you. The TEDs, the tell me, the explain, describe, and we'll perhaps all recognise debrief at the end of a session. Tell me about that approach to the jetty. An open question. You're inviting the person you're interviewing to tell you as much as they possibly can about what is going on. You then potentially need to ask some probing questions, the 5 W's and the H. But what, where, when, who, why, and how? Who was the lookout? Where was that rope? And so on and so on. Just things to put in the detail. And then finally, if you need to, the closed questions. But as I said earlier, the risk of closed questions is that people will give you pretty monosyllabic answers to closed questions. So, was he wearing a life jacket? That's a yes or no question. But you really only want to ask those towards the end. And another top tip from coaching: 2 ears are 1 mouth, so we can listen twice as much as we speak. And that goes without saying, that we want to hear what the witnesses have to tell us, not be telling them what we know already. So, interviewing. Now, plan your interview agenda before commencing. Try to put the interview at ease. Engage, explain, tell them what's going on, why you're talking to them, what the process is, so they feel comfortable talking to you. You might need to use a warm-up question just to get them talking, but when you've done that, try and get as full an account of events as possible before you start to probe. Ask for that detail in broad form, open questions, the TEDs, and ask them to expand the account of the material time frame. Technical phrase, material time frame, but what we're talking about is the time frame that you're particularly interested in. If you've asked a really good open question, someone might tell you everything that started from the moment they got up in the morning, got showered, dressed, had breakfast, and so on. And then they realize that they're talking quite a lot as they're getting closer to the accident. So they just skip to the main bit, and they've missed out the detail in the half an hour, the hour, or whatever it is, leading up to the thing you're really interested in. But go back and ask them to fill in the gaps there. So you've got as much of that as you can. Then probe for the detail, the five W's and the H, and then move on to your agenda, asking all those questions that the witness hasn't covered for you, and that can be all sorts of background stuff. You know, when were you last afloat? Where did you do your courses? Yeah, and so on and so on. It could be a whole bunch of things that you want to know. Think very carefully before disclosing something to the interview that they do not know already. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. But the risk is that you tell someone something that they didn't already know. They leave your office or the cabin or wherever it is you happen to be doing your interviewing, and they bump into the person who's next in line, and they immediately tell them something that they didn't know, and all of a sudden you're contaminating witnesses. So think carefully before disclosing something to an interview that they don't know already. We're not trying to be secretive. We're just trying to make sure that we get the best accounts possible. And the final thing is, think very carefully before challenging the interviewee's account of events. And the reason I say that is that once you start to challenge what they've told you, then cooperation can go out the window pretty quickly. And if you're going to want to come back to them and ask all sorts of other things that you perhaps didn't get round to first time you sat down with them, then if you've upset them badly, they're not going to be very cooperative next time round. So challenging the interviewee's account, yeah, it is sometimes necessary to challenge why someone thinks something has happened, but always be very reluctant to do that, and certainly you don't want to be doing that very early on. And then, you know, summarize the next steps and close the interview. I love mind maps. I tend to write all this stuff down in a sort of a mind map so I can quickly follow it around. Introduction, witness account, explore the witness account, your agenda, disclosure, challenge, and so on. And the reason I have these prompts, the interview plan, the mind maps, and all the rest of it, is because you really, really want to be listening to what your witnesses are telling you. I was listening to Clive James on the radio some time ago, and he was talking about being a professional interviewer, and he said, you know, one of the things you've got to do is listen to your interviewee's answers. You know, if someone has told you that yeah, they've finished their A levels, and you say, so you know, what did you do before you went on to university? And they say, oh, well, I murdered my parents. You don't want to then just go in with your next question, which was, yeah, well, were you living in halls, or were you living out in the town when you went to university? You've got to listen to what they've told you, because that could absolutely affect the next question that you ask. And if you're internalizing and thinking about those next questions, you're not listening effectively. So get some prompts in front of you so that you can listen to what your witnesses are telling you. Collecting human factors evidence can be a little bit tricky. The first thing is individuals' accounts can be unreliable. Misinformation effect. Memory becomes less accurate because of interference from post-event information. The Paddington train crash back at the turn of the century was interesting, because the people interviewing the witnesses to that found that the people involved had the best recollection of events immediately after the accident, and the longer it was before they got to those people, the more their recollections were contaminated. Contaminated because they'd watched news programs, they talked to other people involved, they perhaps, in our circumstances, they'd gone and looked up the procedure before being interviewed, so they knew what they should have been doing rather than what they actually did. Post-event information can really contaminate witnesses, and it's really challenging to then break out what they thought happened at the time with what they have now reconciled in their brain as to be the sequence of events. What it means is, if you get a choice, talk to the people who were involved before you talk to the bystanders, because the other thing that came out of the Paddington train crash example was that witnesses, people not involved but observing, actually had a better recollection of events a little while after the accident. It took a while for what they'd seen to sort of gel in their minds. So talk to the people involved before you talk to other people if you can. Next point is the idea of observation, interpretation, and intention. And this is that what we observe is the first thing that goes in. we then interpret what we observe, and from that interpretation, we then intend to do something. So perhaps use the example of someone who has altered inappropriately in a rule of the road situation. And the first thing is, well, they don't know the rule of the road. Well, it may not be that that's the case. It could be that they do know the rule of the road, but what they saw or what they thought they saw, could be in the lights at night or whatever it happens to be, meant that they were interpreting things differently. And absolutely, they do know the rule of the road. They would, if presented with something that made sense, they would alter in the correct direction. But what they thought they saw meant that they did something different. So if what your witness is telling you isn't making sense, then just think about what it was that led them to make that decision, the observation, interpretation, intention, flow of things. And my sort of final point of this is cognitive biases, a massive topic. And cognitive biases affect all of us in multiple ways. They affect witnesses, they affect interviewers, they affect students and principals. Cognitive biases are a massive topic. But the one I just want to focus on very briefly is the anchoring bias. And that is that the mind gives a bit too much weight to the first piece of information it receives. Initial impressions or data anchor the thoughts. And when we're training our inspectors, we very much make the case to them, you've talked to your first witness, they've given you an account. Don't assume that account is necessarily the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. What you're getting is that individual's recollections of what was happening. And the biggest mistake you can make is then going to other people and simply wanting to fill in the gaps. If you're talking about something that happened, for example, on a rib, the natural tendency would be to go to the instructor or go to the helmsman or so on and get them to tell you about it. But possibly the person who's going to give you the best information, not necessarily the first person you talk to, but the person who can give you the best information, is the other student who is sitting further back in the boat, who's able to observe everything without being distracted by the need to actually drive the rib or monitor the person driving the rib. They're sucking in everything, and the information they give you fills in that gap. So keep your filters open, don't prejudge everything, and don't be anchored by that very first piece of information you get. So that's interviewing. Let's move on to context. Always worth building the background context to what was going on, so that you can see what perhaps best practice does look like, or what procedures should have applied, and so on. In this case, what rules and guidance apply to this. And the other one is has it happened before? Could be that this is something that's happened before. Look, check back in your incident books and logs and so on. Going back to my point about the flooding, if you've got a series of problems with water ingress, then that ought to be sitting there somewhere in the maintenance log. It's giving you some clues as to what the problem was, and so on. But I would also suggest looking at accident investigation reports. And I'm going to publicise the MEIB's reports, of course I am. But there's a very well-known powerboat trainer who had a dunking some years ago because he was doing some own boat tuition powerboat level 2 course, and the apparently new boat that he was teaching on, the console came detached, slipped over to one side during a high-speed turn, and he ended up in the water. Fortunately, he'd already trained the students how to do a man overboard recovery. The controls still worked, and they were able to pick him up, which was good stuff. But I'm sure he learned a lot about checking over boats for own boat tuition, and how things like consoles are attached to the deck, and so can you by looking at accident investigation reports and so on. So whatever your operation is, if there are accident investigation reports out there that are pertinent to your operation, well, give them a read. You may find something of use there. Look for factual evidence wherever you can get it. Memories of individuals are naturally very, very woolly, and one of the biggest problems we have is that timing and the passage of time. It's quite unusual for someone to be able to tell you, yes, we absolutely did this at such and such a time. And so factual evidence is where you can start putting timelines on things and trying to put the sequence of events in order. This is an example of a track plotter, and I hope if you're operating with track plotters, they are set up to record. And if they're not, perhaps one of the first things you want to do after listening to this session is to go away and make sure that they are. But this is a passage from the UK across the Channel down to France, and you can see that 2/3 of the way down there is a bit of a detour. And now that may well be our material time frame. That's the bit we're interested in. But by looking at this, you can start to pick out the times things happened, as the speed of the vessel, and so on and so on. So looking for factual evidence, always useful. And the other really good source of factual evidence, particularly nowadays, is CCTV images, mobile pictures, and mobile phone videos. We as a government organisation have the power, the authority to go and require these things to be handed over to us. But the reality is we very rarely need to get heavy-handed. We ask people, and we're always amazed at how willing they are to let us have a look at something. And a picture of a vessel leaving the port from the harbour office, or someone's video on their mobile phone, or something like that, can tell you so much more than you can get from the interviews itself. So always look for this other factual evidence if you possibly can. So let's move on to analysis. I think at last count there were something like 278 different methods of analysing accidents. So it's a huge topic. And I've listed a few here today: casualty analysis, diagram, barrier analysis, change analysis, fault tree, and so on and so on and so on. But it's the top four that I want to just talk to you about a little bit, because I find them particularly useful when I'm trying to look at what I've learned and make some sense of it. The first one actually is more than that. It's also a way of capturing what you've learned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a casualty analysis diagram. And I've started to draw up an example here, and it is only an example, so please don't get too wrapped up with the detail of it. But it's just to illustrate what's going on. So it's a training centre, a jibe, and an unintentional jibe leading to a capsize, resulting in a head injury of a student. So that's the accident. And we start to gather our evidence and so on, and it turns out that the team assembled about 9 o'clock for a briefing on the first session. 9:15, they were down there being taught to rig and to launch the boats. There's then a bit of a coffee break. After coffee, they issued warm and dry clothing, and then the second session was reaching and going about. And as I say, I mean, that may not be the way that you teach dinghy level 2, but for the purposes of this, that's what's happening. And then at 11:43, there's this unintentional capsize. Betty is smacked on the head by the boom, pretty dazed when she enters the water, and needs to be rescued by the safety boat. So we're starting to build the picture. But this is your diagram, it's no one else's. So you can start to fill in the gaps. So and draw on it really whatever you need to. So 9:15, an instructor demo, students watching, and the students came in pretty cold and wet for their coffee break, which is why they had to issue warm clothing before going back out again to go afloat. Looking at the intended schedule, there was the brief, launching and rigging, coffee break. There was going to be another brief before that first session afloat. So what was the weather doing? Well, the weather was increasing quite a lot during the morning, increasing to around about 20 knots by coffee time. Pretty heavy rain squall during that first session. So you can see what I'm doing. I'm just adding bits and pieces to this picture to try and get a picture of what's going on. What was the forecast for the day? Well, the 0600 inshore weather forecast was northeast 2 to 3, increasing 4 to 5. Showers of rain and sleet, visibility poor, moderate in showers. So pretty forecast weather conditions actually. So perhaps you might be thinking, well, they're issuing a warm and dry clothing. Maybe that would have been better done earlier on in the day, because our coffee break obviously had to extend quite significantly whilst we took time to do that. And so we've ended up in this second session, no briefing, no dinghies not rigged, no briefing start and so on. So perhaps there was a bit of a rush into that second session. So you now time to think about the time pressures on the program and so on. Do you see what I'm doing? This is building up the picture of what's going on, and this is a tool for you as investigators to just to start getting your head around the events. A good way to think about things is what are the barriers that could have stopped this occurring? This looks a little bit like James Reason's Swiss cheese model with all the holes lining up. And again, this is quite an old model, and in some quarters it doesn't have a huge amount of credibility anymore. People have moved on to more up-to-date methods of thinking about things. But rather than thinking about all the holes allowing things to go through, thinking about the barriers that could have stopped things. So perhaps had that weather forecast been taken more account of, and issuing of warm and dry clothing happened at the beginning of the day, then maybe we wouldn't have had that hiatus over coffee time with needing to warm everyone up, get them dry, and then issue them with clothing before going back onto the water, and that wouldn't put the program under pressure. Perhaps if that briefing before starting it happened, it would have given the instructor supervising a bit of time to actually look at the weather conditions and go, hang on a minute, we need to put some reefs in here before we go afloat. What ifs, but thinking about the barriers, another way of thinking about what went on and where you can perhaps make improvements to stop things happening again. We're not in the blame game. We're trying to prevent future accidents from happening. Another good way of thinking about it is change analysis. What was different about today? We've run this course 6 times this year, all been without incident. This course was a disaster. What was different about this course? What was different about today? And again, that could be a very useful way of homing in on the things that perhaps need some attention. And the final one I'm going to talk about is fault tree analysis, and this is quite useful for mechanical things, and so you perhaps have got a problem with, let's go back to my flooding example, bilge water building up, and so it's not particularly obvious where this water is coming from. So sitting down and listing all the places that water could enter the boat from, going through all the through-hull connections, looking at the saltwater cooling circuit, looking at the stern gland, and so on, making sure that you've got them all listed, and then methodically going around and checking each of them. So here we've got the car won't start, control status, is it in park, was the foot on the brake, and so on. So methodically going through everything to make sure that you are being holistic in driving through and finding out what's going on. So that's a bit about the analysis process, and so then we get on to our conclusions to help prevent a recurrence. And one of my principles is an 80% solution that people buy into is much better than a 100% solution that they dismiss as impracticable. And it's also true of risk assessments. If you sit back in your ivory tower and conduct a desk-based risk assessment, you're going to miss something. Getting your instructors, your staff, or the people you work with involved in that risk assessment is going to identify the real risks that they face doing whatever it is that they're doing for you. And the same is true for solutions to accidents. Getting them involved in the solutioneering is a much better way of getting them to buy into the solution than sitting back remotely and giving them this 100% perfect solution, which they then dismiss as impractical because they haven't been involved in the process. So what you do with your conclusions and how you prevent future accidents is a really important part of this process. Just a little bit about the hierarchy of controls. This comes from the health and safety executive, but the best thing to do, of course, is that one at the top. That's the eliminate the hazard altogether, and that's the best way of preventing things. If you can't do that, can you substitute that hazard with another hazard, something that's perhaps a little less hazardous? We're then into things like engineering controls, collective protection, isolating people from the hazard, the mechanical bits and pieces that we can adopt. Next down, the procedural controls. And this is where things start to get a little bit woolly because it's about people again. It's the way they work. The procedural controls, procedures, processes, practices are all ways, again, of avoiding hazards. And the bottom one, the least favorite, is to protect the worker with personal protective equipment. And I think we'd all agree that we don't really want to or have to put hard hats on every time we go sailing because of the risk of jibes. And there may be other things that we can do to protect people from being struck on the head before we have to resort to hard hats. And that's pretty much it. So it's been a bit of a gallop, and apologies for that. As I said at the beginning, it takes quite a long time to train an accident investigator, but you need to write and summarize your findings for future reference. Are you going to circulate a draft to ensure your facts are accurate? Who is going to see that final report? Who's going to get briefed on it? Have you captured your findings and conclusions? All quite important parts for posterity. If you don't have time to review all your risk assessments and method statements at the time, then perhaps that's this report is something you want to put on file so that when you do your annual review, you can pull it back out again, look at what you've learned and feed that back into your risk assessments and method statements. And always be aware that perhaps your centre inspector or someone is going to want to look at your accident book, and they're going to look at the accident book and go, that's quite interesting. What did you do as a result of that? If you could pull out a report that shows that you actually took a really keen interest in it, sucked the marrow from the bone, learned the lessons from it, and put in place some practices that are going to help prevent it happening again, they're going to be pretty impressed with that. And the final point on this one is how you go to monitor to check that your changes are making a difference. And again, it just comes back to good practice, really. And that is, how much are you monitoring your instructing staff? How much are you overviewing what is actually going on in your organization? Passage planning, you send someone off to plan the passage for you. Are you going through it with them before you start to execute the passage? It's all about good management, monitoring and delegating, but knowing how much monitoring you need to be doing to make sure that what you want to happen is actually happening at the coalface. And an investigation, the report that goes into the drawer with no findings at all is really no better than a self-licking ice cream. If you're going to indulge in this practice and you're going to spend time on it and doing it properly, then really you've got to make sure that the output of it is tangible. So that's it, a quick guide to accident investigation. Main topics I've covered in overview included why investigate at all, thinking about what it means to your organization, the professionalism that demonstrates, what your threshold is for investigating, the stuff that's going to be of interest, thinking about interviewing, a difficult skill, but if you apply coaching techniques to interviewing, you won't be going far wrong, but also have a plan of what you need to know, which is not what the witness has told you. Think about the other information and context, and then how you're going to analyze it, and the reports and recommendations. Lots of information online, lots of textbooks out there, courses you can go on, but I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you very much.